Hello and welcome to today's episode of Rainer on Leadership, your online home for leadership lessons and advice for the local church. I'm your host, Sam Rainer, and I have with me my father, the founder and CEO of Church Answers. And this is kind of a new sort of podcast. I guess the content will be kind of the same, but we're doing some
podcast and video cast. And so you have a cheesy smile. I have a non-smile. So, and yeah, when I do it, it's cheesy as well. So I'm trying to put some thoughts in my mind where it could give me a happy place. Football, college football. I can start going in that direction.
Is college football really your happy place?
Yes. Because
all of the memories I have of you are of you being very upset over college football, or at least maybe not upset, but intense.
Intense is a good state for me.
All right. We have a great topic. We're going to be talking about the neighborhood church. It is something that I am passionate about. I know that you're obviously excited about any kingdom work, but the neighborhood church is something that I know that you see as the future. But before we get into that, want to thank our sponsor, Vanderbloemen. And love what they do at their organization. If you are a church or a school, nonprofit, values-based business, or family office, Vanderbloemen would be honored to serve you. And their team's goal is to empower yours by aligning your people solutions for growth. They do things like hiring, compensation, succession, and culture. So hire the right people, pay them well, plan for the future, build a culture that lasts, and you can learn more at vanderbloemen.com.
So, Sam, we have had that particular Vanderbloemen blurb for several months now, and I get to focusing on it. And William, if you're watching or listening, you listen as well, William Vanderbloemen. So, if you are a church, school, nonprofit, values-based business, or family office, how can a person be a church, school, nonprofit? I mean, aren't we personifying organizations now?
Well, I think the you can imply a collective of people. So,
okay. Well, who's listening? Church, school, nonprofit, or people listening? I'm just looking at that, and it looks like an extreme personification. We'll move on.
No, but what if Rainer on Leadership is part of the morning session at a school, and they just play the podcast, and the whole of the school is listening? Then that would make sense.
We'll move on. The neighborhood church, I really became passionate about the neighborhood church by watching you. And I saw what you were doing at West Bradenton and how you were leading the church to transform to become a church of the neighborhood, in the neighborhood, and realizing that, gosh, this is a model for the future. It was pre-COVID. You think of pandemic back then, and we would have thought of 1918. We certainly wouldn't have thought of 2020 moving forward. And I saw this neighborhood church model, and now after the pandemic, it really looks like it is going to be one of the incredible movements of God in many areas. So you not only have the academic writing on it, you not only have the resource provision on it, but you also have the experience of doing it. So we're going to talk about, imagine what a neighborhood church could look like if it got healthy, and it got healthy on a large scale. So those points we're going to cover, Sam. And let's start off with this thing called the stigma becoming the advantage.
Yeah, I mean, if we think back to when these neighborhood churches were formed, a lot of them were formed in the post-war boom. So you've got areas right outside cities that are becoming suburbs, and now those areas are now not so much suburban as they are kind of inner core neighborhoods, if not actually urban. So there was an expansion of the suburban areas right outside the city core in the post-war boom. And part of what happened was that, they didn't call it a church planting movement back then, but it was.
Sure.
And they called them mission churches or church starts. I mean, there's some different language that was used, but it's amazing to me to think about all that was happening in these neighborhoods. So they've got these new neighborhoods that are forming. Now they're old neighborhoods, right? So these are homes that were built in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And they've got these churches that were built on little plots of land, 4 acres, 3 acres, 5 acres, which back then was a lot. Now people would say it's probably a little tight for a lot of churches. And over the years, you get into the 70s and 80s and 90s, the suburbs expand out even further. Some of these neighborhoods deteriorate, unfortunately. And you had some things like white flight going on, which wasn't exactly the best thing that could have happened. That being said, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you might have driven around some of these neighborhoods, looked at some of these churches, and some might have scoffed or thought that there's not much hope, or thought, well, we don't really need to worry about revitalizing these churches, even though that wasn't a term 30 years ago. Let's just plant new ones. All of that is flip-flopped. So, we can talk about the qualitative nature of whether that's good or whether people were thinking right back in the day or whatever. That's not the point. I'm just trying to share the facts to get to this idea of a stigma. Now, these locations are highly desirable. You've got neighborhoods that are transitioning back to being a little healthier. You have land that is no longer available. Some of these areas of cities, like you couldn't even dream of getting that land now. So the stigma of 30 years ago, oh man, this is kind of a rougher neighborhood and a declining neighborhood, and that poor church. I bet you they wish they were out in the suburbs. All that's going away.
Let me take you back to February 23rd, 1980. You remember it?
Vaguely.
Well, it should be vague because you were coming from your mother's womb on that particular day. And within 6 weeks, 7 weeks, maybe 8 weeks, I don't remember, you were in the nursery of a neighborhood church. It was called the Golden Springs Baptist Church in Anniston, Alabama. Your nursery worker that was there the entire time we were at Golden Springs, while you were from age 0 to 4, something like that, was a lady who went by her last name, Jobson, or Miss Jobson. And it was the neighborhood of Golden Springs. Then it went through a struggling time, and guess what's happening now? Well, at least the last time I heard. It is a thriving neighborhood church once more. And I'm going to guess 4 acres. I'm speculating, but from being there, I'm going to guess around 4 acres. So you were born in a neighborhood church.
And
you were born and raised in Alabama on a church way back up in the woods. No, you go on.
There's a song behind that. There's usually a 60s or an early 70s song behind.
Yeah, but we'll move on.
All right. So West Bradenton's a similar story. It's funny that we're West Bradenton. If you look at us on a map, we're Central Bradenton, but it's still called West Bradenton. So these churches that were built back in the day, 40s and 50s and 60s, we'll say, they were woven into the fabric of the community. They were placed there intentionally. A lot of people walked to church back then or drove, a very short distance. A lot of them carried the name of the community. So West Bradenton is a kind of an area of Bradenton. That's the name of the church. So a lot of these things that were maybe stigma's too strong, but I don't think so, now are a draw. Mm-hmm. You couple that with the megachurch movement waning. I don't think it's, I don't think it's going to disappear, but it was a baby boomer phenomenon. We've talked about that on this show. Now that the baby boomers have, coming of age, I guess, and there's more millennials, the megachurch just isn't as much a thing, although I still think it can do a lot of good. It's just not as much a thing, which means there's an opportunity to capture a new audience that has children that would go to a neighborhood church. So I just don't think it's as much of a stigma. I think this is a good thing. I think it's a healthy thing. I think that if you're a pastor at a neighborhood church, you probably have more of an opportunity than you realize.
Second point in this about how the neighborhood church could make a comeback, one of the reasons is church fostering is becoming more common. For the viewer and for the listener, the church fostering movement is something that is growing. You've probably heard of church adoption, sometimes called church replanting. That means that a new church that is started in the place of an existing church. Usually the existing church is shut down for a while. New leadership comes in, maybe new name, likely new name, and then they restart again. We call that church adoption, where you bring a new church into the family. Church fostering is one step before that. It's very much analogous to the human situation. Sam is a classic example, both at the church level and at the family level. They have fostered different children, but one of the children that you fostered, Dominic, is now an adopted child. So Dominic is now adopted Rayner, but that began Dominic Rayner, but that began as a foster that turned into an adoption. But you have fostered other children that went back to their biological families. And so fostering is a temporary something that could result in something where adoption becomes the permanent situation.
Yeah, and if you heard noise, that was one of my foster kids.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes. That was
Journey. Yes. I've learned from babysitting all of your kids, however many there are at the moment, that Journey.
Currently 67 in our house.
How many?
67.
Okay, I believe it.
That's what it sounds like. Maybe it's not quite that many, but
yeah.
No, the church fostering movement is in its inception. I mean, there's always been churches that have helped other churches.
Right.
But this is intentional. This is, it's like you've always had families that have helped children, but when you foster a child, it's a very intentional process. When you foster a church, it's a very intentional process. It is, 6 to 12 months is kind of a typical time frame.
Because if you go past 12 months, you're creating dependency. Right.
And just like in the foster system, I mean, really your whole goal is reunification. It's to get the child back to their family. You don't necessarily want to foster to adopt unless it just happens, because you're kind of rooting against the family. So with a church fostering situation, church fostering can turn into you adopting another congregation. But really the whole goal on the front end is let's get them back to where they need to be. Let's get them to a place of better health. And I do think that this is going to become more common as some of the stigmas around neighborhood churches fall away. And I think that is currently happening. There is more of an attraction to some of these churches and an attraction to helping some of these churches. And I think fostering is a great way to do that.
And so
like sending worship leaders, sending a preacher, if they don't have a preacher, sending one of your best, Sunday school teachers. There's all sorts of ways to help a church just to get back on its feet.
And let's tie this into neighborhood churches and back to our theme, how the neighborhood church can make a comeback. A number of neighborhood churches are being fostered by healthier churches. Those fostered churches may be adopted, they may not be. As Sam said, you don't go in with the intentionality that it's going to end in adoption, but it does sometimes happen. And so the church fostering movement is going to be a movement that will complement, enhance the neighborhood church movement. So quickly give us, I know you've done it on other podcasts and other venues, but quickly give us the South Side story, which was a church fostering story that became a church adoption story from a neighborhood church story. All three.
Yeah. So both Southside and West Bradenton are neighborhood churches. Now that they've adopted, it's West Bradenton Baptist Church Southside Campus, and it's neither west nor really south. So it's a strange sort of geographic, moniker there, but so be it. It is kind of the neighborhood, so it works. Southside was a church that we had a few families that have been connected there. So Southside was a church that had faded, unfortunately, and the few people that were left, there's like 12 people that were left, were all driving in to the neighborhood and not part of the neighborhood. And they approached us, and I had some connections there and some family connections. My grandpa went there, that sort of thing, with some church members, and it just kind of came to my attention. Hey, they need help. They may not make it. And I said, okay, well let's help them. And this is where the idea of fostering came from, was the whole Southside story. While I was fostering children, I'm like, well, I guess we're fostering a church now, aren't we? And that's where the idea came from. So we started sending a preacher, Alan Andrews. He probably doesn't listen to the podcast, but if he does, he's a really great guy. And he works in the foster system, actually.
If he does listen, he's a really great guy. If he doesn't listen, he's not. No, go on.
No, nothing like that. Nothing. Anyway, he was my licensing specialist, and so we sent him as a preacher over there, and he helped get them back on their feet, and then we started doing some other things, and next thing we know, it's about a 6 month to a year relationship where we've got them to where they're not going to die, that they are building some momentum, and then they came to us and said, we want to be part of your church family. Thanks for helping us, but we really think we need to become part of West Bradenton. And I wasn't really expecting that. I certainly was not aiming for it. I knew that we needed to go, quote unquote, multi-site, but this was a church 2 miles down the road. So it's not like I was thinking about planting another campus 2-3 miles down the road. And we're at a time in our church to where we hadn't worked everything out within our own congregation. We were in some transitions ourselves. So it wasn't an ideal timing, but God was part of it. And they're actually, Dad, they had almost 40 people on Sunday, on July 4th. And they had, I want to say, like 8 or 9 kids there, something like that on Sunday.
That's a great story.
So we've gone from a church that had 12 people, all senior saints, wonderful people, but no kids, no future, and no vision. And now we've got 40 English speaking, and then we had another 20 or 30 Spanish speakers in a service that we started, a Spanish speaking service. So there was over 50 people on campus.
So
at the time of this recording, that was a July 4th Sunday.
So let me get it right. You're a neighborhood church. You have fostered, you have adopted, you have revitalized, and you're multi-site and multilingual.
We have 6 services, 2 sites, 2 languages, 4 preachers.
All right. That's a story in itself. We may need to get that story at some point.
Not for this podcast. Here's the lesson. Neighborhood churches are great. They're always going to be a little messy. Fostering, adoption, all of this. It's awesome, but it's going to be a little messy.
Well, if we're going to get through these last 2 points in just a few minutes, we've got to go at a messy speed. Local pastors become less like islands and make friends. What are you talking about there?
Well, what I mean by that is I think a lot of pastors can, at least locally, act like islands. They don't interact a whole lot. There's not a whole lot of cross-denominational pollination. That sounds really bad now that it came out of my mouth, but
I wouldn't say that.
I think people know what I mean when I say that. Tribes not talking with each other for whatever reason. I think that's beginning to break down some as the neighborhood church movement takes hold. There's actually a church, a Christian church between our West Bradenton campus and our South Side campus. So they're 3 miles apart. We've got West Side, which is a great church. It's a Christian church in between those 2 campuses. We're friends. We're actually, we just started partnering with them on some student ministry stuff. So we're not acting like an island. We partner together for helping the homeless with another ministry that's local. I'm friends with the pastor. So I think as the neighborhood church movement takes hold and as the neighborhood churches make a comeback, you're going to see churches act, hopefully, this is more hopeful than it is predictive, act less competitively and more cooperatively and less like islands and more like friends. And as this movement really picks up steam, I think we're going to see more of this. And I'm excited about that because the friendlier we are with each other as local churches, even if we have some doctrinal differences, the friendlier we are as brothers and sisters in Christ, the better the kingdom's going to be. So, and the better the neighborhood's going to be.
And that's a good segue. When you have a neighborhood church get healthier, inevitably the community is getting healthier because you can't separate the two.
You can't revitalize a church without also revitalizing a community. The call to shepherd a church is the call to shepherd a community. Those 2 things go hand in hand. Because if your church is doing the mission of God and if your church is doing the things it should be doing, guess what? The neighborhood's going to get better. The community is going to be revitalized. People are going to come to Christ. The gospel is going to take hold in your particular location. So as neighborhood churches get about the mission of God, community revitalization is going to occur.
Yep. And that to me is part of the banner that neighborhood churches are waving right now. The banner is, we are here in the neighborhood for the neighborhood. And many times their name reflects the neighborhood. West Bradenton is in a larger neighborhood called West Bradenton for many people. I can never remember what street it's on because every street's numbered, but it's 638th Street, something like that.
It's 43rd and 13th. Come on, you lived in Florida for a little while. Streets run north and south, avenues run east and west.
Yeah, and I remember when I was a pastor in St. Pete, it was 22nd Avenue North. So I do remember that one.
It's impossible to get lost in this part of Florida. Everything is a grid pattern. Everything is a street and an avenue, and it's all numbered. So
and if you go too far, you'll be in the water.
Yeah, if you go east, that's when the street nomenclatures go from west, 43rd Street West, to east. Which, by the way, if you mail me something, please don't forget to put the east, west, northwest, whatever on there, because it goes to a completely different part of town if you don't. So anyway, I've had that problem before with mail, but
this
that's another podcast that's not church related.
Well, this neighborhood church movement is an incredible movement of God that I think we're going to see more and more of. I think we're going to see more fostering. Certainly church replanting or adoption is going to take place. But I love the fact that we're contextualizing so much that the churches are getting healthier and making the neighborhoods healthier. We'll continue to talk about the story, and it will continue to be a great story. Speaking of great stories, Southeastern Seminary is a great story. They're committed to helping you get the training you need to pursue your ministry from anywhere in the world. They will waive the application fee. If you are listening here, Church Answers, use the code Church Answers. There's no space in there. They'll waive the fee. No matter what stage of life's journey you find yourself, we want to help you take your next step in getting equipped to disciple and teach others. And coming to Southeastern, you'll find that your seminary is not just about theological education. It's about ministry preparation. Explore degrees, schedule a visit, or apply today at sebts.edu. That is sebts.edu. Well, thank you for joining us here on Rainer on Leadership. And if you watch it on YouTube, subscribe there. If you listen to it on iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, subscribe there. Wherever your podcasting app is, I guess we would say, in addition to watching it on YouTube. And hey, join us at churchanswers.com. Go to that site. There's a lot of good stuff that is there. And if you don't believe me, just go there and maybe you can be part of our community, because that community is absolutely incredible. As a matter of fact, you can just go to churchanswers.com and find out more about that community. Let me also mention this, Sam, before we go. The Know Your Community Report, not only for neighborhood churches, but for all churches. The Know Your Community Report is one of the most powerful ways to discover your community through demographics and psychographics. If that sounds boring, it is not. You can really find some ways to minister there. Look in the show notes, look into resources, go to Know Your Community and get, what is it, Sam, 60 pages, 70 pages? I don't know.
Yeah, it's right around 60 pages. And I'll just say this, you can't reach your community unless you know your community. So this is a great way to figure out how to reach your community by just understanding who's there.
Go there. Great report. And if the number of pages intimidates you, there are nice infographics that summarize it on the front of it, so you can look at those as well. As always, thank you for joining us at churchanswers.com. And we will continue to, as you now see us, as well as listen to us, continue to help grow churches together.